Okay, welcome to Unlocking Astrology with Samuel Reynolds, the unlocker himself. Unlockastrology.com is where you can find him. Today, first of all, thank you. Welcome. I appreciate this time and I appreciate the time before I hit record. We have these conversations about life and people. Very interesting, which is what this whole journey is about. We're just talking about people wedded to things, wedded to ideals, and not discovery of self. Like, and if you strip away their title or their organization or their group, they're nothing.
Right.
And I think everyone should ask themselves, what are they outside of those things? And if the answer is I don't know, then that's the pursuit, right? Find out.
Including in terms of signs. Some people like don't know how to find themselves beyond like what they learned in terms of one marker, like, oh, I'm an Aries, or I'm a Taurus, or I'm a Pisces. Part of this work is doing the active exploration to see what other things can offer, like astrology, beyond just what you've heard or seen or what you've been warned against.
Mm. So there are people who, again, they consult their charts every day. They go, they have an astrologer. I was watching Tina Turner, the documentary on HBO Max. Wonderful. And because she participated in it. And she said, she consulted her psychic because, she kept being asked this question about Ike and she was really upset about it. And somebody approached her about doing a book. And she said, she consulted her psychic and the psychic was like, do the book because that will open. And that did open up, that brought the movie. There was a best-selling book. It shaped the next phase of her life in a way that was, incredible in terms of, blowing her up even more. And I was thinking about when she said that. I was like, Nancy Reagan had a psychic and an astrologer. We talked about that in the past. So who are they consulting and what, how does this all work exactly?
Well, obviously, a psychic is going to be different from an astrologer, but like, yeah, Nancy Reagan had Joan Quigley, who was, the family astrologer who also consulted for the president. I mean, now this is well documented, even though it was well suspected, because Reagan had like his first inauguration at midnight or some weird time. Not the presidential one. I think it was really the gubernatorial one when he was in California. So he had long been consulting with astrologers, and then there are other notable people who have had astrologers. Sylvester Stallone has an astrologer, his mama. Vin Diesel has an astrologer, his mama, right? Elizabeth,
Wait, their mamas are astrologers?
both of them.
Oh, wait, Stallone and Vin Diesel's mothers are astrologers?
You got it.
Okay.
So I mean that helps. I'm sure it's been helpful, definitely in Stallone's career, right? But I mean, the big name that had an astrologer that I kind of reference is Queen Elizabeth I. So, the Virgin Queen, right, who was known as the Virgin Queen for multiple reasons, including being a Virgo, right, had John Dee as her astrologer, who kind of dictated the time for when she was coronated, who dictated the time related. And now this is very significant in understanding astrology's place in history, because it's Elizabeth I who sets up what becomes the British Empire, right? So this is the moment where this small isle comes to have dominance related to the continent. And when I say the continent, I mean Europe, right? That goes into these other things. So this is during the time of the Spanish Armada, all these different things where we have the tide of history changing, where British comes to rule the waves, right? So when we understand that there are various people who have astrologers, you can see why it's important, I think, for people of color, which is why I've mainly serviced people of color for all these years, to have an astrologer and also to call for more people to study astrology so they can also do it. Because, there have been these other people who've been benefiting from quote unquote psychics and astrologers and, all kinds of different work. Yeah, I mean, these are just some examples. There are other people who, talk about the Rockefellers having astrologers. there are some of my clients who will remain nameless, obviously, who have astrologers you wouldn't know.
We've talked before about, Black people, of course, our aversion to, you know, satanic things and idolatry, and because the Bible's very clear about steering clear of divination and all of this. So we have a spiritual battle that we're going with, because many of us are devout in our understanding of religion, at the same time have this vast history of consulting ancestors and consulting the stars. You've said in previous discussions that we've had about the three wise men. What were
Right.
that? And so I think a lot of this for me, as well as cracking the myth of religion and seeing where, we're not using our full tool case, we're not using all of the tools in our toolbox, because we've been stunted on purpose, I believe. And we have such a narrow view of spirituality. What do you
Correct. Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that's often what has happened. And like I said, there is a caveat where I do think, some of the religions, especially the Abrahamic religions, have a suitable argument, against astrology, which is like where you come to venerate other things more than your relationship to the divine, and where you have more faith in those things, then that's a problem, right? So if you're reading your horoscope and more fearful related to your horoscope than your prayer life or your relationship to prayer, and not using the horoscope as a possible guide for how it's working with your prayer and working with your understanding, I think that's a problem, right?
Talk a little bit about that, because I know you're a practicer, follower.
Yeah, I practice a religion. I'm not someone who's against organized religion, but I have been that, so I understand that sentiment. What I would say is that, no, you don't have to lock yourself into an organized sensibility. But one of the benefits of a quote unquote organized religion is that it helps with your sense of accountability, right? In terms of, because you can be spiritual and make up all kinds of stuff that allows you to misbehave and mistreat people. Some of the most ratchet people I've ever met are quote unquote spiritual people who have no organized religion or whatever, but they also have no organized sense of belief or treatment of people. And again, I don't want to say that if if you're along one trajectory, one or the other, it's not extremes, but let's be real about what can happen. So in terms of dealing with prayer and, whatever spiritual practice you have, whether it's meditation, that becomes the essence of getting to know yourself, getting to know your divine self, being in that reciprocity. I see astrology as a tool related to that in terms of cementing a greater understanding of the cosmos and things at work. When I was an atheist, and I was an atheist for a number of years, I mean, almost over a decade, when I was an atheist, I do believe it was astrology that kept me attuned to the possibility of the divine, right? Because seeing things consistently in my studies of astrology that were uncanny made me realize that this goes beyond the limits of my understanding, right? And this is where we talk about, even as the Bible, we're lean not unto thine own understanding, right? This is where you kind of tap in. And the miracle, I would say, often of astrology is where it does open up things for you and doesn't just lock you into fear and whatever. Now, if you're seeing an astrologer or reading an astrologer that continuously locks you into fear and rather than your faith, then that's a problem, And I think it's more so where I'm not saying that you always have to go with a happy-go-lucky, everything's going to be all right, overly optimistic astrologer or whatever, but or astrology, it is recognizing that it's walking a line, as we say in Islam, there's that the Siratul Adil, in terms of walking along the bridge that takes us into paradise, so it's the same sensibility of recognizing how you walk along your path of faith. So I think astrology can be instrumental in that, because even Jesus's life started with like people coming to him based on the faith of following stars.
I know you're going to break down the different types of astrology, but as you're talking, I'm also, I'm thinking for you, that walk to faith came because you saw the possibilities through astrology.
Right.
A person that is consulting an astrologer, what process should they, how do they, because like when I go to the doctor, there's a certain part of medicine right now that I'm distrustful of, because I feel like you don't have a job if I'm healed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once I'm healed, I don't have, we have our checkups, of course,
Right.
but medicine is made in the sickness. So we have drug companies, right? And it's like, okay, all of these side effects, I take this drug, now there's all of these other things, and I got to take this medicine to combat these things, so that the business of medicine continues, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little cynical about the medical
Fair.
field right now. So I think as an astrologist, if you have helped me solve some problems in my life, I don't have to come back to you. So there's almost kind of a built-in stringing along, either optimism or pessimism that will get somebody back in front of you to be diagnosed with what to do next. So is there a point where you can, provide a prescription and folks don't have to come back?
Well, I think the natural prescription is what someone is going through at a particular time that compels them to see an astrologer, right? I always ask my clients, basically, what do you want to know? What's important for you to know during this session? Because I go with the presumption that they have some burning need for why they booked this session, spending their ducats to talk with me, right? Because unlike a doctor, right, which is where you have to be essential, deemed an essential worker, an astrologer is not necessarily an essential worker. So for them to have the extra ducats, because I don't always go with the assumption that my clients have a lot of money, and many of them don't. Some of them save up. I also have payment plans. So some of them are working to me, seeing me on a payment plan, which is not extra, it's just dividing it up by 3 or 2 months, in terms of seeing me. I go with the assumption that they're trying to work on something. And the length of what that something may be could be just in terms of a year or a few months, a particular time frame. I do say, yeah, come and see me, 6, because people are like, well, how often should I see you? Some people see me 6 months to a year, but I don't go with the assumption that they have to, right? So it's more so conditioned by what's happening in their life. Some people are like, I just feel a certain way, or they're wondering about the nature of relationships. Some people are listening to this show and have been listening to you or listening to me on your show. And like, I'm just curious. So in terms of understanding, and I think what I hear in that curiosity is that, I feel somewhat out of alignment with my intuition. I just want to hear what someone else might say. And they might say like, yeah, this is spot on. That's what I was thinking, blah, blah, blah. And then they feel better or they feel connected. And sometimes it's also true. They like, yeah, nothing that mofo said to me made sense. I don't think I get that often, but that can happen where it's like, yeah, I mean, that's it. That's not my thing. And I don't see that person again. I mean, those things also can happen. So I think it is different now. I will say on an unethical scale, it is possible for an astrologer to string people along, right? And I think that's where we do get into questions of ethics and problems. You might say like, well, how? Well, it can be, where they drop something an astrologer drops something at the end of a session. We've been talking about something like, well, we could be talking about your love life, but we're at the hour now. So, maybe you need to book with me another time frame, and then we could talk about your love life, right? I think that's grimy, right? That's not what I do, but I mean, that can be done. And I've heard about it being done, right? The temptation is there when you're learning and you're getting out there. Of course, you have the mind like, oh, wait, I could do this. I've done phone lines. I know how games can be played. Until when I said phone lines, those psychic hotlines and different things like that. Games are played on there like that. I think that's where people have to be aware, I'm being strung along, given breadcrumbs to kind of lead me along towards something. So people have to be cautious, aware. I mean, maybe this is a good thing to talk about before we get into talking about even astrology. How do you know you're not dealing with a hack or dealing with someone who is just, full of BS? Well, a couple of things I tell people to look out for. One, look out for references, or people who have talked about this other person. And you have to go beyond just what is on your social media, right? Because you can see a lot of people who are active on social media, but, you know, they've only been on social media for a year. And yeah, they have high praise and they may have a website, but who else is talking about them? How much do they know? You know, who has seen them, right? Have you seen them in action? You know, do you check them out on their YouTube, whatever? So I think it's important to pay attention who's been out there, right? And who's referencing them, who talks about them. I think that's something to look at. You know, for instance, with myself, I've been on Twitter for, 11 years, right? So if anyone, if you're gonna, you can find all kinds of dirt on me if it's dirt on, on Twitter, but I don't think you're gonna find it, right? There are more people who reference me in those particular things. This is true for some other people, notable astrologers, notable Black astrologers, from Sagittarian Mind, a friend of mine, to Mecca Woods, to Janelle Belgrave. We reference each other, we support each other. We're not in competition with each other, right? So you want to look for that. Does this astrologer spend more time bad mouthing other people or being self-defensive and protective? And talking about other things rather than, related to like things that they normally talk about, positive things or informative things. So I think these are important things to look at. I have a blog post on this too. I probably will send the link to you so you could put it in the chat, where I talk about how do you find a quote unquote astrologer or psychic or other person so you don't get scammed.
Love it. And that should be the hallmark of everything, like protecting people.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're in a response, you're responsible. The Bible says, to whom much is given, much is required. And then you're held doubly accountable. Woe to the teachers. And it's like, yeah, you're in a position where you have to be impeccable in terms of how you deal with people, because the enormous amount of responsibility, because people will trust you.
Exactly.
So.
And I value that trust. And I think that's what someone should look for. Do they show that they value that sense of trust? There was an astrologer who was big in the early days of Twitter, who, created a PDF with a password, and then kind of put it out there. And then when you opened it, she talked about other people's charts, right? And,
wow.
Right? That's grimy. That's bona fide. She's one of the few astrologers on Twitter I've ever gone after like that. I was just like, that's low, to talk about someone who trusted you, right, with their information about their issues in a public arena, right? So that's what you have to look, but this is someone who also complained about, like, I'm tired of being responsible for people's secrets. Then disappear, then go away, stop doing the work.
Hello. All right. So what kinds of, what are there 3 types, I think? 3
Jim,
types?
no, there's more than that. It's all kinds of, so yeah, I want to talk about, so what most people need to know, they know that there's something called natal astrology or horoscopic astrology, which is, there's all fancy names for it, diathaliacal, where you talk about a birth chart, basically, which is what you mostly have seen me do on your show, where someone gives me their birth time, birth data, right? And I talk about their birth chart. So this is the most popular form of astrology. But there's also horary astrology, which is not conditioned on your birth time. It comes from the time when an astrologer understands when you have a particular question. Where's my watch? I lost my watch. I lost my dog, right? I lost my kitten. So this form of astrology is called horary astrology, where I can create a chart from, the time I understood or have learned about your question, and use that chart as a guide towards solving a particular issue that you may have or question.
So when my dog disappeared, Tippy, when I was 10, I could have come to you.
Yes.
And asked you, did my mother sell Tippy, or did someone literally come into our yard
and
steal her? You could have answered that for me.
Yes, that's what horary can do. Yes.
Still a burning question, by the way.
Right.
Okay.
It has to be okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to that, but yeah, it's and you use the right phrase that we use. It has to be a burning question, and it has to be a question there are a lot of different conditions related to the question. And when I say a lot, not to the point where I can't do some of the things I said, but like people ask, you can't, it's not appropriate to ask a horary astrologer, like, did the Prophet Muhammad talk to the angel Jibril? Right? That's not something that, or to ask, like, if you're not playing for the Eagles, right? To ask, like, will the Eagles win tomorrow? Now, some people do disagree with me on that, some astrologers, but it's more so, what are burning questions for you that are happening, that are impactful for your life, right? And ideally, in the ethical sense, it's things that are more related to you. When I say that, so like, I don't think it's a proper horary question to go to an astrologer and say, like, is my, you know, the person I'm having an affair with going to leave his wife, right? Oh, I get questions like that. I've gotten questions like that, where people are like, you know, they've even been able to volunteer and give the wife's information, like birth information, right? So I don't think that's ethical. So it's more so in terms of horary, you know, like you might say, like, am I on the proper road to develop a relationship with this man? Even though he might be married, whatever, this is like whatever, but that's about you and him, as versus drawing in an extra her, right? If we're talking about, you know, cishet relationships. So this is one form of astrology. Then another form of astrology that I do as well, that people, you know, consult me for, is locational astrology or astrocartography, about finding places on the planet that may be suitable related to their chart. So people ask me, like, why are you moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico? Because I looked at the astrocartography, and I know what that place can do for me related to my chart. So these are things that one can do related to like particular cities or places you want to go. So that's another form. There's medical astrology. That is not my expertise, but there are, you know, expert medical astrologers who have studied the correlation between medicine and astrology, who can pinpoint particular issues related to what's happening in your body, and kind of take it from there. There's mundane astrology, which is what we have talked about. Mundane astrology is more so dealing with the world, you know, mundus, you know, the idea of like royalty, or, you know, in terms of what's going on with government. Like I've done some of that when I talked about the Pluto return with the United States, you know, so there are some people who really focus in on, you know, what's going to be happening with Iran, you know, or what's happening with this in this particular country based on this country's chart, and what's happening in terms of other traditions that we tie in related to astrology. Let me see, there's political astrology, which is another form of mundane astrology. There's psychological astrology. So many people who have come up in the 70s, the 80s, and part of the 90s reading particular astrology books, they were exposed to more psychological astrology, which is kind of the tie-in related to Jung, like as in Carl Jung, and then also in terms of Sigmund Freud, Freudian transactional analysis, you know, all these different forms of psychology, and they matched it with astrology to understand more about the dynamics with your parents and family and things like that. So that's also another form of astrology that many people use. And then there are different schools of thought, like there's Hellenistic medieval astrology, there's more the idea of something called Uranian or symmetrical astrology, which is not about signs as much as the planetary relationships with each other. So there's all these different ways of looking at astrology. There's also something that I see growing on Twitter, but it has a longer tradition, especially through Vedic or Indian astrology, called Sidereal Astrology. I've talked about that briefly. Sidereal Astrology is the viewpoint of using, rather than fixing the zodiac related to the sun's turns on the earth, which we correlate to seasons, but it's better to look at how it relates to like the Tropic of Cancer, or going toward the Tropic of Cancer, which we call summer, but it depends on where you are in the globe, right? Going back to the equator, which goes with two signs, Aries and Libra, then going to Tropic of Capricorn, which goes to Capricorn, which is what we call the winter solstice, depending on the globe. So it's not really about seasons as much as the Earth's turn. That's what most people know as astrology related to what we call the tropos, or the tropics, or tropical astrology. Sidereal astrology bases it on usually one particular star, Chitra or Spica, and then imagines the zodiac in 30-degree increments as it relates to the constellations. Now, when I say as it relates to the constellations, it's not that sidereal astrology is more accurate related to the constellations, but some measure of it, because it focuses on a star, connects somewhat more or connects a little bit to the constellations. When I say connects a little bit, all of them use 30-degree increments, sidereal astrology, tropical astrology. The constellations are not all 30 degrees. So for instance, Virgo and Pisces are huge. Like if we were talking about the sun journeying through Pisces or Virgo, it will be like 40 days, right? As if we were talking about it going through Aries or Capricorn, it would be less than that. If we're talking about it going through Scorpio, it'll be about 8 days. So when many people say, well, sidereal uses more the constellations and it's really more the actual constellational, that's BS. It's not true. It's not more tied to the constellations as much as tied to a star.
So let's get to the mundane.
All right, what about the mundane?
Are you a mundane astrologist?
I do some mundane astrology. I am more a natal astrologer because I like talking to people about them and their charts and what's happening in their lives. I do locational astrology because it's one aspect of it. I missed another form of astrology too, sorry. I do horary. And another form of astrology that's important, I talked about this a little earlier in the mundane sense, electional astrology. So you can have an astrologer elect the most auspicious time related to your wedding. You can have an astrologer elect the time related to when you wanted to send like a particular email, or you want to do a particular application, or set up a particular interview, right? Ideally, you can use what's called electional astrology for the time, I would say more so the date related to a surgery. It's tricky to try to do the time because, with surgery, it depends on when they can wheel you up into the operating room. But you definitely can avoid days where I would say not to. I can speak about this from my experience. So my recent experience is that, when I was sick a few weeks, well, now a month ago, I knew I had a kidney stone, right? And, because that's something I had talked about with my doctor. And when I knew that I was going into the hospital and had to go to the hospital because I was really sick, the moon was in Libra. Now, Libra has an association related to the kidney. Now, it is conventional wisdom in electional astrology that you don't do an operation when the moon is in a sign related to the body part that you want to operate on. So when they told me they were going to operate when that moon was in Libra to get that stone out, I was like, Lord, be with me, because that's not necessarily good in terms, I just hope there's no complications. Well, there were complications and they couldn't get the stone out, right? Then.
But you knew that, so you couldn't hold it off because the pain was too much, though.
Correct. But if I had, didn't have to deal with the pain, I might have said like, okay, wait a few days, but I couldn't. But the astrology proved true because they didn't get the stone out that day. So that's just a testament related to like what an astrologer can do, if you had some measure of choice.
So I was going to ask you if some of this is self-fulfilling, right? So I believe in intentionality. I believe that you can attract what you think and what you say, what you write down. I believe that there's power in that word. And so I go to an astrologer, you tell me X, Y, and Z. Now I believe it. And the belief of what you tell me manifests it, not necessarily what you're telling me. How much of that, you've put it out there for people, and then their spirits and the energy and the universe grabs onto it because they now believe what you tell them?
Well, usually I'm looking to put it in, even if they're dealing with a difficult situation, in the affirmative. I'm looking for, remember, I told you, fate has two arms and one of them is your own. So my focus is on working that arm. So if they have belief and focus on finding a way that works in their advantage, then I think that's kind of the work, which is like they use some measure of their self-affirming power matched with the timing of things. Now, if it's something that becomes negative, like, oh, well, you know, I talk to them about possibilities related to their relationship where they may be going toward, separation. Now, if they go toward a separation, here's where it's an interesting conundrum, but I don't think it's that deep. You could say like, well, then, if they divorce, you kind of put that in their head. Well, I could only have fulfilled that or helped them fulfill that if they were inclined to think about divorce. If I'm dealing with a solid couple where it's like, no, that's not happening, it's not going to happen.
Okay.
It's kind of that, this is where people have to recognize, with this question about free will and different issues, some measure of it has to exist in you. Like, people talk about this with, con artistry and, being a con, it's hard to con an honest man. Right. So that's where we have to kind of weigh out that if, when we talk about, well, how much of it, did the astrologer influence? Well, how much was already in you? Some measure was probably confirmation that you knew you're going toward this particular moment. The astrologer said it even independent of you, and the moment was, maturing anyway.
Okay.
So you're skeptical about that, but that's a longer conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm skeptical about a lot of things.
Good.
Like I have to be convinced, and once I'm convinced, then it's it's
well, good. I mean, I think skepticism in this work is good. I think too much belief can be dangerous, actually.
Yeah, and I think that for everything, I think people should be cautious in all of the things that and verify, double, triple check. When they in carpentry they say measure twice, cut once. I think we should live our lives that way. So we don't make as many mistakes. But the mundane, we live in America. It is the end of March 2021. So whenever people see this, they'll see it. America, I believe, is on a trajectory. We've talked before, especially during election time and before you've been on my show, talking about where America is going. I believe, just based on the signs and studying history a little bit, that she's on the pathway to a fall.
Who is this?
America.
Okay.
United States of America. This experiment.
Yeah.
Have you done a chart?
Well, I've looked at many charts. I mean, America is going toward its Pluto return. There's a growing number of fissures, and like this whole thing that happened on January 6th. One of the problems I have with how the media, our politicians are treating it is as if it's just this incident, not dealing with it. No, this is a point of a movement that could become a greater thing. Maybe law enforcement does recognize that, but I don't often see this. And I think it's important to see that there's this fissure, and then there's also in terms of what's happening on the left. And so America really is trying to figure out what she is, who she is, and that's coming to a head. And I think part of what's coming to a head, because you and I talked briefly about Derek Chauvin and what's happening with him. And this is something I keep drilling. One of the key litmus tests, barometers for understanding what's going to be happening with America is to keep looking at what's happening with the police. Is to keep looking at what's happening with the police, because the symmetry between how we have been talking about the police, especially over the last 10 years, how that's become much more emphasized, really comes with how we talked about the redcoats during the American Revolution, in terms of the Quartering Act, search and seizure, we talk so much about, taxation without representation, without realizing what the colonists really struggled with most was having to deal with a military that didn't respect them on the ground, right in front of them, as a foreign power, right? Without their sense of autonomy, which is why Americans created militias in the first place. So this whole issue related to the police and even American militia even though these folks who are mainly white creating militia, who I see in many ways as my foes, they're actually dealing with a similar foe and a similar fear related to law enforcement and authority. But we're not having that conversation. So we have to keep watching the police because they're the barometer. And I'm not, obviously, those who know me and, especially like Larry Daniels and other people, no, I'm not favoring the police. I'm not saying like watch them because, they're actually, how can I put them? I see them as occupying power in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so many of us too. The irony is that January 6th police were the enemy. Few of them, one got beat with a
got killed
flag, with an American flag. They killed one, crushed one. I mean,
but Black Lives Matter is the problem. So I mean, this is
it is complicated, right?
Yeah, right. But this is at the heart of it because how we are having this encroachment of law enforcement in our lives in various permutations, from surveillance to I mean, so many different elements in terms of what they can do, where you have broad scopes of authority, where you can have like a university police having as much authority as, municipal police. And just think about all the different forms of police that we have around us, in terms of governing us.
Right. For many Black people, we are only seeing it through the lens of COINTELPRO and through, of course.
It's going to get white people too. That's kind of the thing.
Right. What you're saying is that just like opioids, drugs, just like HIV, just like anything.
And I've been saying this on Twitter for 11 years. I'm like, they're going to come for you too. I challenged, and then I know we have to go, but I challenged, during the 2012 election, between Obama and Mitt Romney, I could challenge a conservative and say, when they would talk, because we would talk about Black people being killed by the police. I'm like, okay, you go find me some white people who've been, killed unarmed by the police, right? And I knew you're gonna find about four cases, right? I can't do that now. I'm like, oh, you probably can find more. They're gonna kill you too, right? And it's not gonna be so much about whether they're Black or white in terms of the cops, right? It doesn't matter. You're not them. They're creating a whole different, almost level of civilization that doesn't include you. And when I say civilization, I'm not just talking about like, New York City cops. I mean, like in terms of the sense of, whether we're talking about Interpol and the sense of network they have between different senses of brotherhood or around the world, that's not about you. But that does relate to what's happening in terms of the United States and how we are talking about that. I mean, people say like, well, why are you so focused on them? You should be talking about the law system and the justice system in general. Attorney generals are fearful of the police, right? They won't do certain cases because of the police. Judges fearful of the police, right? In terms of what's happening in New York City and the relationship between the mayor and the police and what they decide to do. And that whole thing last year, with firecrackers and fireworks going off and the police and this lawlessness, the things that are happening in New York City, you think that's because just of the mayor? It's because of the police. So there are things happening in this country in the relationship to law enforcement, again, almost like the redcoats and people on the ground, that we're not dealing with. And it's not me just saying just defend the police, because I think some part of that is important. It's really talking about, as citizens, how are we going to be responsible for each other? Which was the question the first time. When I say first time, I mean 1776.
Right. Crispus Attucks. It's so
right.
Much
and Crispus Attucks. I think I talked to you about that. Crispus Attucks, in terms of what happened with him, was exact parallel in terms of something with George Floyd.
Yeah,
with Uranus.
We've talked about that. Oh my goodness. So this case, Chauvin I feel like they're going to sacrifice him to keep the calm.
Well, we'll see. They haven't so far, and even when they have, it's like they're off the force, but it's not necessarily they keep them in the jail. I mean, I think Oscar Grant's murderer may be out now. it really all depends, I think, police are given a different metric in terms of like what constitutes as, criminal. And I think I read a little bit about the defenses, about Chauvin's defense, which is kind of like it was a crowd, kind of distracting him and blah, blah, blah. And so, we'll see. I don't have as much faith. I don't, I would like to see maybe they sacrifice, or maybe there's a sacrifice toward justice, but
I'm asking, what do the charts say, Samuel?
I haven't looked at it that way.
Okay. All right. Well,
yeah. So that's, but that's a good question, but I don't have that yet.
Okay. All right. Well, let that be homework.
Okay.
Maybe because I need us to be prepared for whatever, but I need us to be prepared.
Okay.
What we need to do next. Listen, I appreciate you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love you. You look good. I love your
Thank you.
In garb. I love your bright smile, and I love your sensibilities and how.
Well, thank you, Karen, for glowing like light. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I will see you next week.
Inshallah.
All right.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.